The best fuck I had last year. Some decisions in life come without warning. They creep up on you like a shadow in the night, and before you know it, you're questioning who you've become. My name is Elizabeth, and what I'm about to tell you is the story of how I found myself step by step in a moral gray area, driven by love, desperation, and, ultimately, the unexpected. That night, we were at home in the suburbs. The atmosphere was quiet, and the silence between Tom and me was longer than the conversation. We had been married for 10 years, and although I loved him, our relationship had changed over time. We no longer held hands in crowded rooms as we used to, but rather brushed past each other in the same bed, almost like strangers. But that night, the atmosphere was different. He seemed nervous, drinking whiskey, his brow furrowed, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Elizabeth," he finally broke the silence. His voice was low and almost hesitant. "Yes?" I put down the book I was pretending to read and looked at him. "I need to talk to you about something important." I nodded, my chest tightening. Conversations that started out this way usually didn't end well. "My business," he began, then paused and let out a heavy breath. "It's in trouble. Big trouble." I frowned and leaned forward. "What do you mean? You never mentioned—" "I didn't want to worry you," he interrupted, running a hand through his hair. "But things have been bad for months, and now we're on the verge of bankruptcy. If things don't change soon, we could lose everything." I was stunned. Tom had always been the steady one, the breadwinner of the family. He had never confided in me about his troubles, and now he dropped this bombshell. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" I asked, my voice tinged with frustration and fear. "I didn't want to worry you," he repeated, his tone much softer. "But there is someone who can help." "Who?" "Richard Carter." The name was familiar. Richard was a wealthy businessman who made headlines for his success and charisma. He had everything Tom didn't: boldness, charisma, wealth. What does he have to do with this? Tom hesitated, and for the first time in years, I saw a flash of shame cross his face. He was interested in me pitching him my business, but he was also interested in you. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. "What?" "He mentioned you in one of our conversations. He's seen our pictures and thinks you're very pretty. He said that if you were to show some interest in him, he would be willing to help me." Tom paused, unable to finish his sentence. The room felt like it was spinning. "Are you trying to ask me to?" "No," Tom said quickly, his voice rising. "I would never ask you to do anything you didn't want to do." But he hinted that he might be more willing to invest if you were to appear by his side, show some interest. I stared at him, trying to understand what he was saying. My trusted husband was asking me to seduce, no lure, another man for the sake of his business. This is crazy, Tom. How can you suggest something like this? I don't know what else to do, he said impatiently, despair rising to the surface. I've tried everything, Elizabeth. Everything. This is my last chance. Our last chance. I'm not asking you to sleep with him. Just convince him you're interested. Make him feel like he's got something to invest in. His words hit me like a slap in the face. Do you hear yourself? You're asking your wife to lie and manipulate people. Tom's face crumpled, and for the first time in years I saw tears in his eyes. I know. I know how bad it is, but I have no choice. Please, Elizabeth, just meet him. That's all I'm asking." I wanted to refuse, to throw his ridiculous idea back in his face. But as I looked at him, at the man I had vowed to love and support, my resolve gradually faltered. I thought of the life we had built together, the sacrifices we had made. I thought of the possibility of losing it all. Just one meeting? I asked softly. Tom nodded. Just one. If you don't feel comfortable, I'll give up. I promise. I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly. Okay, I'll meet him. Tom's face immediately lit up with relief, but it did nothing to ease the gnawing pain in my stomach. As I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just crossed a line that could never be crossed. The days before the meeting were spent in anxiety and speculation. Tom had arranged everything, a dinner reservation at an exclusive restaurant, new clothes, and even a list of Richard's interests. On the night of the meeting, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the black slim-fit dress Tom had bought for me. It hugged my curves just right, and I felt both flattered and a little strange. I hardly recognized the woman in the mirror. "You look beautiful," Tom whispered as he stood in the doorway. I turned around, trying to find a hint of guilt or hesitation in his face, but all I saw was gratitude. "Thank you," I whispered. As I walked out the door, I couldn't help wondering if this was the beginning of the end, or the beginning of something new that I just couldn't understand yet, something that could change our lives forever. When I arrived at the restaurant, Richard was already sitting at a table near the back. He stood up when he saw me, and his tall, imposing figure made my heart race. "Elizabeth," he said in a deep, steady voice, "I'm glad to finally meet you." "The pleasure is mine," I replied, forcing a smile. As we sat down, I couldn't help noticing how effortlessly he commanded attention. His suit, his easy smile. No wonder he was so successful. Over the course of the evening, we talked about everything: art, travel, business. He was charming, attentive, and sincere, and it was intoxicating. For a moment, I forgot why I was there. I forgot how important Tom and his request were. As the waiter cleared our plates, Richard leaned in slightly, his eyes fixed on me. "You're an amazing woman, Elizabeth. Tom is a lucky man." His words sent shivers down my spine. I wanted to respond, to change the subject, but my mind was a jumble. When the evening ended, I felt like I was teetering between loyalty and something far more dangerous. When Richard kissed my hand and said goodbye, I was certain of one thing. This was just the beginning. When I got home that night, I didn't say much to Tom about dinner. He asked the questions I'd expected. How was it? What did you talk about? Did he seem interested in the business? But I gave short, vague answers. I told him Richard was polite and charming, we had a good chat, and he seemed willing to listen to Tom's business plan. But the truth was, the situation was much more complicated. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about Richard. His deep, attractive voice, the way he always looked at me for a second longer than necessary, the way his words made me feel seen, heard, even admired, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. I tried to push these thoughts aside, to bury them under the weight of everyday life. But no matter how hard I tried, They kept coming back, like a song on repeat. So I wasn't surprised when Richard called me later that week. What surprised me was that I quickly agreed to meet him again. The second meeting was different. This time, we met in a hotel bar in the city center. It was quieter and more intimate, a place where the conversation could continue late into the night without interruption. When I arrived, Richard was already sitting in a leather chair, holding a whiskey in his hand. He stood up when he saw me, with a warm, friendly smile. "Elizabeth," he said in a silky voice, "I was beginning to think you weren't coming." I wasn't sure if I should come, I admit, sitting across from him. "I'm glad you did." The way he says it, and the way he looks me in the eye, makes my heart race. The conversation starts off naturally enough. We talk about Tom's business, Richard's investments, suburban life versus city life. But as the night goes on, the mood begins to shift. "You know," Richard says, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "you're not what I expected." "Oh." I raise an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" He leans back in his chair, his eyes on me. "I thought you'd be more conventional, more polished. But you're different. There's something real about you. Honest." I smiled, my voice soft and strained. To be honest, I wouldn't describe myself in those terms these days. He tilted his head, curious. "Why?" "Let's just say I'm not here because I want to be," I said, my voice almost inaudible. Richard's gaze softened. "So you're here for him?" "For Tom." I nod, my throat tightening. "He thinks you can save his business. I think he thinks I can convince you to give it a try." Richard doesn't answer immediately. He just stares at me, his expression inscrutable. Finally, he sets down his glass and leans forward, elbows on his knees. "Elizabeth, what do you think?" The question catches me off guard. What do I think? What do I think about all of this? What do I think about me being here? What do I think about you? I hesitated, unsure how to respond. The truth was confusing, tangled in emotions I didn't fully understand. I began, then paused, searching for the right words. "I think you're not what I expected either. I think whatever this is, it's a lot more complicated than I thought." Richard smiled, the corners of his mouth rising slowly, revealing a meaningful arc. "Complicated can be fun." His words lingered between us, full of meaning. I felt my cheeks flush and quickly averted my gaze, focusing on the flickering candlelight in the center of the table. "I should go," I said suddenly, standing up. "Elizabeth, thank you for the drink," I interrupted, "but I can't do this." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out of the bar, my heart racing. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see Richard's face, hear his voice, and feel his presence. At dawn, I was in a state of emotional chaos, with feelings of guilt, shame, curiosity, and other things I couldn't quite put my finger on. Tom noticed my mood, but didn't pursue it. He was too focused on his own troubles to pay much attention to mine. When I mentioned dinner and a follow-up meeting, he said, "You've done enough. If Richard is interested, he'll contact you. If not, then, well, we'll figure something out." But Richard did contact me. The third meeting wasn't planned. It was pure coincidence, or so I told myself. I was in the city center on business and caught sight of him by chance outside a cafe, sipping coffee and checking his phone. He looked up as I walked past and our eyes met. For a moment, I considered pretending not to see him and walking away. But for some reason, I stopped in my tracks. "Elizabeth," he said, smiling and waving me over to him. What a coincidence. I hesitated for a moment, then walked over to him, my heart racing. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to sound as casual as possible. "Having coffee," he said, holding up his cup. "And now, apparently, running into you." I couldn't help smiling, and before I knew it, I was sitting opposite him, holding a cup of coffee in my hands. Our conversation flowed easily, like old friends rather than strangers. As the minutes ticked by, I felt myself letting go of my tension, my guilt, and the constant self-questioning. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. But I soon learned that freedom always comes at a price. When I left the cafe, I knew things had changed. What had started out as a reluctant affair had become something more personal. Richard had touched me, and no matter how hard I tried to resist, I knew I was falling. As I walked back to my car, his words echoed in my head. Complicated things can be fun. He was right, and that was what I feared most. I did not expect this to happen. In fact, I spent several days convincing myself that it wouldn't. I told myself that Richard was just a distraction, a charming man with a powerful attraction. I told myself that I was still me, faithful and solid as ever, wholly committed to my marriage. But I discovered that deep down I knew that a lie is the easiest story to tell yourself when the truth is too dangerous to face. The first time it happened, I felt as if I were a spectator. Richard had invited me to the penthouse suite of his home under the pretext of discussing Tom's business proposal. He spoke so formally and professionally that I was convinced it would be a harmless meeting. But as I walked into the room, I knew it wasn't just a business meeting when I saw the magnificent view of the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows and the intimate setup of the room. "Would you like some wine?" Richard asked, holding up a bottle of red wine. I hesitated, but nodded. He poured 2 glasses and handed me one, and my heart raced. "Tom's proposal is solid," he said casually, leaning against the counter. "He's well prepared. I think there's potential." "I'm glad to hear that," I said, taking a sip of wine. The warmth of the wine spread through my body, relieving the tension in my shoulders. "But that's enough about business," Richard continued, his gaze locked on mine. "I didn't invite you here to discuss spreadsheets." I froze, my heart racing. "Then why did you invite me?" He set down his glass, stepped closer, and spoke in a low, intimate voice. "Because I can't stop thinking about you, Elizabeth. And I don't think you're going to stop thinking about me either." The room seemed to shrink around us, and the air was filled with an indescribable sense of possibility. I opened my mouth to protest, to deny his words, but nothing came out. Because he was right. He reached out and brushed a stray hair from my face, his fingers stroking my cheek. "Let me stop," he whispered. I didn't. I replay that scene over and over in my mind, wondering when I crossed the line. Was it when I agreed to meet him? Or when I accepted the wine? Or when I let him kiss me, his lips warm and firm against mine. Or was it even earlier, when loneliness and longing took root in the quiet space of my marriage? This relationship felt like a walk into a parallel universe. With Richard, I felt rejuvenated in a way I hadn't for years. He was attentive, passionate, and endlessly curious about me. My thoughts, my dreams, and the self I'd buried beneath the housewife persona. Our encounters were stolen moments, carefully planned and executed with the precision of a heist. Midday trysts in his penthouse apartment, weekend trips to nearby cities on the pretext of visiting old friends, late-night phone calls, his voice the last thing I heard before falling asleep. Every time I saw him, I told myself it would be the last time. But every time, I found myself going back. At home, the guilt suffocated me. Tom noticed the change in me, but he completely misinterpreted it. "You seem happier lately," he said one evening as we sat on the sofa with the TV on. "Happier?" I echoed, a sharp pain in my stomach. "Yes. I don't know. Maybe more relaxed. Whatever it is, I'm glad." He smiled and laid a hand on mine. I forced a smile back, mortified by the lie. And Richard didn't seem to care about these moral issues. "Life is short. Don't refuse happiness," he said to me one night as we lay under his covers, the city lights casting a soft glow in the room. "But what we're doing, it's wrong," I said, almost in a whisper. "Wrong." He propped himself up on one hand and looked down at me. "How can something so beautiful be wrong?" I had no answer. Weeks turned into months, and the affair became both my safe haven and my prison. With Richard, I felt free, free to be the other half of myself that I had forgotten. But the guilt of betraying Tom and leading a double life haunted me. I found myself overcompensating at home, trying to be the perfect wife. I prepared elaborate dinners, planned date nights, and laughed at jokes that weren't funny. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that Tom knew. One night, as we sat in bed reading, Tom put down his book and looked at me. "Elizabeth," he began, his tone serious, "are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "In our marriage," he clarified. "Are you happy?" I hesitated, not knowing how to answer. "Of course I'm happy. Why do you ask?" He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know. You've been looking different lately. Like you're not here." I forced a smile and tried to lighten the mood. "This is ridiculous. I'm fine, Tom. Really." He didn't seem convinced, but he let it go. As the relationship deepened, my feelings for Richard grew. I knew I was playing with fire, taking a big risk for a man who didn't belong to me. But I couldn't stop myself. Until the night everything fell apart. I arrived home late, the faint aroma of Richard's cologne still lingering in my hair. I tried to go to bed quietly, not to wake Tom, but he was awake, his voice muffled. "Where have you been?" "Out," I lied, my voice steady. "With a friend." He turned to look at me, his eyes sharp despite the darkness. "Which friend?" The question caught me off guard, and I stuttered for an answer. Karen. From the book club." Tom was silent for a moment, and I could feel the weight of his gaze. "Elizabeth," he finally said, his voice low and firm, Are you seeing someone else? My heart stopped. No, I said hastily, too hastily. Don't lie to me, he said, his tone colder. I know there's something going on. I've known for weeks. The room was suffocating, the walls closing in on me. Tom, I'm not. He cut me off, his voice breaking. Just don't. For the first time, I saw a crack in the man I thought was unbreakable. In that moment, I realized the cost of what I had done. I had betrayed him, and there was no going back. Guilt is a strange thing. It weighs heavy on your chest, suffocating, but you learn to live with it. I thought I could live with my guilt indefinitely, that I could endure the marriage breakup and the lies I told myself. But everything collapsed the night Tom confronted me. Tom didn't yell. He didn't scold or accuse me. Instead, his calm, broken voice was more heartbreaking than any anger. "Who is he?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if he couldn't bear to look at me. "It's not what you think," I said, but even I could hear the hollowness in my voice. "Don't lie to me, Elizabeth." His tone was firm, his jaw set. "You owe me that much." I sat there, motionless, as all the excuses I had rehearsed crumbled under his gaze. "His name is Richard," I finally admitted, my voice barely audible. Tom took a sharp breath, as if the name itself hurt him. For a long time, he said nothing, and I didn't know whether he wanted me to continue or was too shocked to speak. "How long?" he finally asked. "Tom, please, how long?" he repeated, raising his voice for the first time. "2 months," I admitted, the words pouring out like poison. He shook his head with a bitter smile. "2 months. God. I never thought this would happen," I said through tears. "I didn't plan anything. I just wanted to help you. Help us, help us." His voice was shrill, cutting through the air like a knife. "I didn't sleep with him at first," I blurted out, immediately regretting it. My words sounded pathetic, like a child trying to justify breaking the rules. "At first," he repeated, his voice full of disdain. "And then what, Elizabeth? You just couldn't resist?" I covered my face with my hands, afraid to look him in the eye. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "Sorry?" Tom stood up and paced the room. "Do you know what you've done? You've ruined everything." His words felt like a punch in the stomach. I wanted to defend myself, to explain the loneliness I felt, that Richard filled a void I hadn't even realized existed. But how could I defend the irrational? In the days that followed, I wallowed in silence and avoidance. Tom moved into the guest room and barely spoke to me. When he did, it was cold and distant, as if he were talking to a stranger. I tried to reach out to him, to bridge the widening gap between us, but each attempt was met with indifference or anger. "I need time," he said flatly one morning. "Time to forgive you, to decide if I want to stay." I didn't ask. I was too afraid to hear the answer. Then there was Richard. I didn't tell him about the conflict with Tom, but he must have sensed something was wrong. "You've been distant lately," he said when I met him at his penthouse one afternoon. "I've been dealing with some things lately," I replied, avoiding his gaze. "Things?" he repeated, as if expecting a more detailed answer. He asked, raising an eyebrow, his tone suspicious. It's complicated, I said, my voice quavering. Richard sighed and set his whiskey glass on the table. Elizabeth, you know that I'm not involved in some messy love triangle with you. His words stung, but they also revealed the truth that I had been trying to ignore. In Richard's eyes, I was just a fling, a bit of fun. Our connection wouldn't last. I think we should end it, I said, my voice firm despite the dull ache in my chest. He looked at me for a long time, his expression inscrutable. Then he nodded. If that's what you really want. Yes, I said, even though the words stung like sandpaper in my throat. I left his penthouse for the last time, every step bearing the weight of my choice. When I got home, things didn't get better. Instead, the distance between Tom and me grew wider. He buried himself in his work, coming home late at night. I spent the day wandering around the house, remembering the good times we had had and the reality I had destroyed. One evening, as I was finishing the dishes after dinner, Tom walked into the kitchen and leaned against the counter. I spoke to Richard today, he said, his voice calm but a little strained. My heart stopped. You, what? He called me, Tom continued, his eyes fixed on the floor. He said he wanted to continue investing. I didn't know how to respond. You, what did you say? I said no. Tom, I don't want his money, he interrupted, his voice rising. Not because of what you did. Not for that reason. I stood there, stunned by his words. I'd rather lose everything than let him be a part of our lives. Tom's voice trailed off. I reached out, tears welling in my eyes. Tom, I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you. He took a step back and shook his head. This isn't just about me, Elizabeth. It's about us. I don't know if there's anything that can be fixed. That night, as I lay alone in my bed, I realized what I had done. Not only had I betrayed Tom, but I had betrayed myself, my values, and the life we had built together. I didn't know if we could rebuild what I had destroyed, but I was certain of one thing. The road ahead was long and unknown, and it would require more honesty and vulnerability than I had ever known. The next morning, I made a decision. I will fight for my marriage, for Tom, and for the life we dreamed of, even if it means facing my darkest side and admitting my mistakes. Because I know that love is not about perfection, but about perseverance. If there is still a glimmer of hope, I am determined to find it, even if it means starting everything from scratch.